Scott Roberts freezes mid-mop stroke as a female Voth student accidentally spills a viscous, blue liquid across the pristine floor of the Voth Intergalactic Academy's main atrium. It's his first day as the human janitor at this prestigious alien institution, and already he's confronted with a mess that seems oddly intentional. The Voth student, Uma, locks eyes with Scott. Her reptilian features contort in what he can only assume is the alien equivalent of a blush. He notices her body temperature spike, the heat radiating off her scaled skin in palpable waves. Scott's brow furrows as he approaches the spill, mop at the ready. "I'm so clumsy," Uma says, her voice a low, throaty rumble. "Thank you for cleaning up after me." Scott nods, focusing on the task at hand. As he works, he can't shake the feeling of Uma's gaze boring into him. The intensity of her stare makes the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Throughout the day, similar incidents occur with alarming frequency. Female Voth students seem to be having an epidemic of butterfingers, leaving trails of spilled liquids in their wake. Each time, Scott observes the same odd behavior: prolonged stares, increased body temperature, and a strange, almost expectant energy surrounding the students. During his lunch break, Scott sneaks into the Academy's computer lab. His fingers fly over the alien keyboard as he accesses the database, searching for any information that might explain the bizarre occurrences. What he discovers sends a jolt of shock through his system. Voth females enter a mating cycle triggered by the presence of compatible males, and it turns out human pheromones are unexpectedly potent to Voth females, causing them to produce excess mating fluids. These fluids manifest as the accidental spills Scott has been cleaning up all day. Scott's mind reels with the implications. The Academy administration is unaware of this phenomenon, puzzled by the recent surge in maintenance issues. He realizes he must keep this information secret to protect both himself and the affected Voth students. Interspecies relations are strictly forbidden at the Academy, and the revelation of this unexpected compatibility could have far-reaching consequences. As Scott exits the computer lab, he nearly collides with Uma. Her scales shimmer under the fluorescent lights, and he finds himself unexpectedly drawn to her alien beauty. A wave of guilt washes over him as he acknowledges his growing attraction. "Scott," Uma says, her voice sending shivers down his spine, "I was hoping to run into you again." Before Scott can respond, his communication device buzzes. It's an urgent message from the human ambassador to Zorthar. Diplomatic tensions between humans and Voth are escalating, and Scott's position at the Academy is now crucial for gathering intelligence. Scott's heart races as he realizes the precarious situation he's in. He's an unwitting catalyst for Voth mating behavior, harboring a forbidden attraction to Uma, and now he's expected to play a role in human-Voth relations, all while maintaining his cover as a simple janitor. As Uma steps closer, her scent enveloping him, Scott knows his life at the Voth Intergalactic Academy is about to become far more complicated than he ever imagined. The mop in his hand suddenly feels like a flimsy shield against the storm that's brewing, both within the Academy walls and in the larger galactic political arena. Scott's mind raced as he watched Uma walk away, her reptilian form disappearing around a corner. He gripped his mop tightly, trying to steady himself against the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The weight of his newfound knowledge pressed down on him, making the simple act of cleaning suddenly feel like a Herculean task. As the night deepened and the Academy halls emptied, Scott found himself unable to sleep. He tossed and turned in his small quarters, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The revelation about the Voth females' reaction to human pheromones, the secret message from the human ambassador, and the growing tension between their species all swirled together in a dizzying maelstrom. When morning finally arrived, Scott approached his work with a heightened sense of awareness. Every movement, every interaction now carried a new significance. He pushed his cleaning cart through the corridors, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of Uma or other Voth female students. It didn't take long for his vigilance to pay off. As he rounded a corner near a bank of lockers, he spotted Uma lingering nearby. Her scales shimmered under the Academy's harsh lighting, and Scott felt his breath catch in his throat. He watched as she reached for a vase perched precariously on a high shelf, her movements deliberately slow and exaggerated. With a soft crash, the vase toppled to the floor, spilling water and flower petals across the polished surface. Uma's eyes met Scott's, a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something heated and eager, evident in her gaze. "Oh no," Uma said, her voice a low rumble that sent shivers down Scott's spine. "How clumsy of me. I'm so sorry to trouble you again, Scott." Scott approached cautiously, mop in hand. As he drew closer, he noticed the change in Uma's body temperature. Her scales flushed a deep purple, the color spreading across her face and neck like a vibrant blush. The heat radiating from her was palpable, and Scott found himself fighting the urge to reach out and touch her scaled skin. "It's no trouble," Scott managed to say, his voice slightly strained. He focused on cleaning up the spilled water and scattered petals, acutely aware of Uma's gaze following his every move. As he worked, the sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention. Scott looked up to see Professor Zax, the head of Voth Human Relations, rounding the corner. The professor's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. Scott on his knees cleaning up the mess, Uma hovering nearby with her scales still flushed a deep purple. "Mr. Roberts," Professor Zax called out, his tone carefully neutral. "A word in my office, if you please." Scott's stomach dropped. Had he been too obvious? Had someone figured out what was happening between the human janitor and the Voth females? He straightened up, casting an apologetic glance at Uma before following Professor Zax down the hall. The walk to Zax's office felt interminable. Scott's mind raced with possibilities, each scenario more dire than the last. By the time they reached the professor's door, Scott's palms were slick with sweat. Inside the office, Scott was surprised to find they weren't alone. A tall, imposing Voth male stood by the window, his military bearing obvious even to Scott's untrained eye. Professor Zax closed the door behind them and gestured for Scott to take a seat. "Mr. Roberts?" Zax began, his voice low and serious. "This is General Krill. We've been monitoring your activities since you arrived at the academy." Scott's heart hammered in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but Zax held up a hand to silence him. "We're aware of your unique effect on our female students," Zax continued, "and we believe this phenomenon could have far-reaching consequences for Voth human diplomacy." General Krill stepped forward, his scaled features set in a grim expression. "The Voth High Council is considering severing ties with Earth," he said, his voice a deep growl. "Tensions between our species have been growing for some time. However, this unexpected compatibility could change everything." Scott's mind reeled. He had known his position at the academy was important for gathering intelligence, but he hadn't realized the stakes were quite so high. "We have a proposition for you, Mr. Roberts," Zax said, leaning forward in his chair. "We want you to continue your work as a janitor, but with an additional task. You'll gather information on the extent of human Voth compatibility. This could be crucial in preventing a diplomatic breakdown between our species." Scott swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "And if I refuse?" General Krill's eyes narrowed. "That would be unfortunate for all parties involved." The implication was clear. Scott nodded slowly, realizing he had little choice in the matter. "I understand," he said. "What exactly do you need me to do?" As Zax and Krill outlined the details of his covert mission, Scott's mind wandered to Uma. He thought of her flushed scales, her intense gaze, and the strange, powerful attraction he felt towards her. How could he balance his duty to Earth, this new mission for the Voth, and his growing feelings for Uma? As he left Zax's office, his head spinning with new information and responsibilities, Scott nearly collided with a male Voth student. He recognized him immediately. Drell, notorious for his anti-human sentiments. Drell's eyes narrowed as he took in Scott's disheveled appearance. "What's a human janitor doing in the administrative area?" he hissed, looming over Scott menacingly. Scott's mind raced, searching for a plausible excuse. His eyes landed on a small stain on Drell's uniform. Without thinking, he reached out and pretended to brush at it. "Just doing my job," Scott said, forcing a smile. "Can't have the students walking around with dirty uniforms, can we?" Drell's expression darkened, but he stepped back, clearly unsure how to react to Scott's unexpected move. With a final glare, he pushed past Scott and continued down the hall. Scott let out a shaky breath, realizing how close he'd come to blowing his cover. As he made his way back to his cleaning cart, he spotted Uma emerging from the library, her arms full of books. Their eyes met across the hallway, and Scott felt a jolt of electricity run through him. In that moment, Scott realized his life at the Voth Intergalactic Academy had become infinitely more complex than he could have ever imagined. As he picked up his mop and resumed his duties, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of something much larger than himself, a potential shift in the very fabric of human-Voth relations. With each step, each swipe of his mop, Scott found himself sinking deeper into a world of interspecies politics, hidden agendas, and forbidden attractions. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning. Scott took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. He knew he had to act quickly and decisively to navigate the complex web of interspecies, politics, and his own conflicting emotions. Over the next few days, Scott implemented a carefully crafted plan to gather intelligence and improve human-Voth relations. He focused his efforts on Uma, strategically positioning himself to create accidental encounters throughout the academy. These chance meetings allowed him to observe her reactions and gauge the extent of their compatibility. One afternoon, Scott found himself pushing his cleaning cart past the library just as Uma emerged, her arms laden with a towering stack of books. He quickened his pace, timing his approach perfectly. "Oh, let me help you with those," Scott offered as Uma's precarious tower of literature began to wobble. Despite his intervention, the books tumbled to the floor, scattering across the polished surface. As Scott knelt to help Uma gather them, he couldn't help but notice the titles: Human Physiology, Comparative Xenobiology, and Ancient Voth Legends and Prophecies. Uma's scales flushed a deep purple as she scrambled to collect the books. "Thank you, Scott. I'm afraid I've been rather distracted lately." Scott handed her the last book, their fingers brushing momentarily. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, and he saw Uma's scales ripple in response. "These are some interesting choices," Scott remarked, gesturing to the books. "Doing some research?" Uma nodded, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Yes, I've been fascinated by the idea of cultural exchange between our species. There's so much we could learn from each other." Scott saw his opportunity and seized it. "I couldn't agree more. In fact, I've been thinking a lot about that myself. It's a shame there aren't more opportunities for humans and Voth to interact outside of formal settings." Uma glanced around furtively before leaning in close. Her voice dropped to a low whisper, sending shivers down Scott's spine. "What if we created our own opportunity? I know of an unused classroom where we could meet after hours. We could have our own little cultural exchange session." Scott's heart raced at the proposal. This was exactly the kind of opening he needed for his mission. "That sounds perfect. When and where?" They quickly made plans to meet the following evening. As Uma hurried off to her next class, Scott couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. He was one step closer to fulfilling his mission, but the growing attraction between them complicated matters significantly. Throughout the day, Scott noticed an increase in surveillance around the academy. He spotted new security cameras in corners where there had been none before, and he could have sworn he saw General Krill's imposing figure lurking in the shadows more than once. As Scott was finishing up his evening rounds, Professor Zax approached him in an empty hallway. The Voth's expression was grave as he pulled Scott aside. "Mr. Roberts, a word of caution," Zax said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm aware of your extracurricular activities with Uma. While I understand the potential for diplomatic breakthroughs, I must remind you of the strict rules against interspecies fraternization." Scott nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. "I understand, Professor. I'm just trying to foster better understanding between our species." Zax's eyes narrowed. "Just be careful. The consequences of missteps in this delicate situation could be severe. However," he paused, glancing around before continuing, "if you can navigate this carefully, there may be an opportunity for a significant diplomatic breakthrough." As Zax walked away, Scott felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. The stakes were higher than ever, and he knew he had to tread carefully. The day of the secret meeting arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension throughout the academy. Scott noticed Drell, the anti-human Voth student, watching him more closely than usual. As Scott went about his janitorial duties, he could feel Drell's eyes boring into him, following his every move. When evening fell, Scott made his way to the unused classroom, taking a circuitous route to shake off any potential followers. His heart pounded as he slipped inside, finding the room dark and empty. Moments later, the door creaked open and Uma entered, her arms once again full of books and data tablets. Her scales shimmered with excitement as she set her materials down on a nearby desk. "I'm so glad you came," Uma said, her voice a low, throaty rumble that sent Scott's pulse racing. As they began their cultural exchange, Scott found himself captivated by Uma's intelligence and curiosity. They discussed human customs, Voth traditions, and the potential for greater cooperation between their species. With each passing minute, the atmosphere in the room grew more charged, the air seeming to crackle with an unseen energy. Uma's body temperature rose visibly as their conversation deepened, her scales taking on an intense purple hue that Scott found mesmerizing. He could feel the heat radiating off her, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. "Scott," Uma said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you. Have you ever heard of the Awakeners?" Scott leaned in closer, intrigued. "No, what are they?" Uma's eyes gleamed with excitement. "It's an ancient Voth legend. The Awakeners are said to be beings from another world who will come to us and unlock hidden potential within our species. Some believe they'll bring about a new era of enlightenment and progress." As Uma spoke, Scott suddenly became aware of how close they were. He could see every detail of her scaled face, feel the warmth of her breath. The attraction between them was undeniable, growing stronger with each passing second. Just as Scott found himself leaning in, drawn by an irresistible force, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. They jumped apart, startled by the sudden noise. The classroom door burst open, revealing a furious Drell. His eyes blazed with anger as he took in the scene before him. "I knew it," Drell snarled. "You filthy human, manipulating Uma with your pheromones." Uma stepped between them, her scales flaring defensively. "Drell, stop. This isn't what you think. We're just talking, learning from each other." Drell's gaze darted between them, his anger palpable. "Learning? Huh? You're betraying your own kind, Uma. And you," he pointed at Scott, "you're violating every rule in this academy." As the confrontation escalated, Scott's mind raced, searching for a way to defuse the situation. But before he could speak, the door opened once again, revealing Professor Zax. "What is the meaning of this?" Zax demanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. All eyes turned to the professor, a mix of fear and defiance on their faces. Scott knew that this moment would define the course of his mission, his relationship with Uma, and potentially the future of human-Voth relations. As Zax began to address the group, Scott's communication device buzzed insistently in his pocket. He glanced down discreetly, seeing an urgent encrypted message from the human ambassador flashing on the screen. The situation had just become even more complicated, and Scott realized that his next actions could change everything. Everything. The urgent message from Earth would have to wait. Professor Zax's stern voice cut through the tension. "All of you, to my office. Now." The group followed Zax in tense silence, their footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. Scott's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan that would salvage his mission without betraying Uma's trust. As they entered Zax's office, the professor gestured for them to sit. "I hope you all realize the gravity of this situation," he began, his scales shifting to a deep, serious hue. "Your actions tonight have potential consequences far beyond this academy." Before anyone could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. General Krill entered, his imposing figure filling the room with an air of authority. "I believe I can shed some light on this matter," Krill announced, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group. The next morning, Scott found himself standing before the Academy's disciplinary committee, a panel of stern-faced Voth faculty members. Uma, Drell, and Professor Zack stood beside him, each looking equally uncomfortable. The head of the committee, an elderly Voth with iridescent scales, spoke first. "We have called this hearing to address the events of last night. Each of you will present your account of what transpired." Uma stepped forward, her scales shimmering with a mix of nervousness and commitment. "Honored committee members, what happened last night was not a violation of Academy rules, but a step towards a greater understanding between our species." She went on to explain the legend of the Awakeners, her voice growing more passionate with each word. "The ancient texts speak of beings from another world who will unlock hidden potential within our species. I believe that humans like Scott could be these Awakeners." Drell scoffed, his scales rippling with disdain. "This is preposterous. Uma has clearly been manipulated by this human's pheromones." He turned to the committee, his eyes blazing. "I've observed Scott's suspicious behavior around the Academy for weeks. He's been seeking out Uma, positioning himself to interact with her. This is a clear violation of our rules against interspecies fraternization." Professor Zax intervened, his tone measured. "While I understand Drell's concerns, we must consider the potential diplomatic implications of this situation. Our relationship with Earth is delicate, and any hasty actions could have far-reaching consequences." As the debate heated up, the door swung open, revealing General Krill. The room fell silent as he strode to the center of the chamber. "Esteemed committee," Krill began, his voice resonating with authority, "I have been conducting covert observations of human-Voth interactions within the Academy. What I've discovered is unprecedented." Krill activated a holographic display showing charts and diagrams. "Our data indicates significant physiological effects of human presence on Voth females, particularly in the case of Uma and Scott." The committee members leaned forward, their scales shifting colors in surprise and intrigue. Hours of intense discussion followed, with arguments ranging from concerns about Voth purity to the potential benefits of interspecies cooperation. Finally, the head of the committee raised a hand for silence. "After careful deliberation, we have reached a decision. While the rules of our Academy are clear, the potential implications of this discovery cannot be ignored. We will allow a controlled study of human-Voth compatibility under strict supervision." Scott's heart raced as the committee head continued. "Scott Roberts, you will be reassigned from your janitorial duties to assist in a new research program led by Professor Zax. Uma, given your existing connection with Scott, you will serve as the primary Voth subject for this study." Drell's scales darkened with anger, but before he could protest, the committee head addressed him directly. "Drell, your concerns have been noted. You will be tasked with monitoring the research for any signs of misconduct." As the hearing adjourned, Scott felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He caught Uma's eye, seeing his own complex emotions mirrored in her gaze. The following week, Scott found himself in a state-of-the-art laboratory within the Academy. The room hummed with advanced equipment, and a team of Voth scientists bustled about, making final preparations. Professor Zax approached Scott, his expression serious. "Mr. Roberts, I hope you understand the importance of this research. The eyes of both our worlds are upon us." Scott nodded, his throat dry. "I understand, Professor. I'll do my best to contribute to the study." As Uma entered the lab, Scott's breath caught in his throat. Her scales seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and he felt the now familiar pull of attraction. "Let's begin," Professor Zax announced, gesturing for Scott and Uma to take their positions in the center of the lab. The first test involved measuring their physiological responses to each other's presence. As Scott and Uma stood facing each other, surrounded by sensors, Scott could feel his heart rate increasing. He watched in fascination as Uma's scales rippled with changing colors, reflecting her own physiological changes. Days turned into weeks as the research progressed. Scott and Uma underwent a battery of tests, from simple proximity experiments to complex cognitive challenges performed in each other's presence. With each passing day, Scott found it increasingly difficult to maintain a professional demeanor around Uma. Their conversations during breaks became more personal, their glances lingering longer. One afternoon, as they were reviewing data together, Uma suddenly gasped. "Scott, look at this!" she said, pointing to a chart on the screen. My cognitive function scores have increased by 15% since the start of the study. Scott leaned in to examine the data, acutely aware of Uma's proximity. That's incredible, he murmured. And look here, your physical endurance tests show a similar improvement. As they pored over the results, Scott noticed Drell watching them from across the lab. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. The tension in the room was palpable, a constant reminder of the high stakes of their research. Later that evening, as Scott was preparing to leave the lab, Professor Zaks pulled him aside. Mr. Roberts, a word, he said, his voice low. News of our research has leaked to the Voth public. We're facing significant backlash from conservative factions. Scott's stomach dropped. How bad is it? Zaks's scales shifted to a worried gray. There are protests outside the academy. Some are calling for an immediate end to the research, claiming it threatens Voth purity. He paused, his expression grave. The Voth High Council has demanded daily reports on our progress. As Scott absorbed this information, his communication device buzzed. He glanced down to see another encrypted message from the human ambassador. With a growing sense of unease, Scott realized that the fate of human-Voth relations might rest on the outcome of their research. Across the lab, Uma suddenly stumbled, clutching her head. Scott rushed to her side, supporting her as she swayed on her feet. Uma, what's wrong? He asked, his voice tight with concern. I don't know, she mumbled, her scales fluctuating rapidly between colors. I feel strange, different. As Scott helped Uma to a nearby chair, he caught sight of Drell watching the scene unfold, his expression a mix of anger and concern. The tension in the room escalated, and Scott knew that the delicate balance they had been maintaining was about to shift dramatically. Scott's heart raced as he supported Uma, her scales fluctuating in a dizzying array of colors. Professor Zaks rushed over, concern etched on his face. We need to get her to the medical bay immediately, Zaks ordered, his voice tight with urgency. As they moved Uma, alarms blared throughout the facility. The lab door slid open, revealing General Krill flanked by a team of Voth security personnel. This situation has escalated beyond your control, Professor, Krill announced, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. By order of the Voth High Council, this research is now under military jurisdiction. Before anyone could protest, Krill's team swiftly secured the lab. Within hours, a section of the academy had been transformed into a high-security research complex. Scott found himself relocated to a small, sterile room within the facility, his personal belongings hastily packed and delivered. Days blurred together as the experiments intensified. Scott's world narrowed to the confines of the research complex. His only company, the rotating shifts of Voth scientists and the ever-present security personnel. Uma's condition stabilized, but the changes in her physiology became more pronounced with each passing day. Her scales developed a permanent iridescent sheen, gleaming under the harsh laboratory lights. During physical tests, she demonstrated strength far beyond her previous capabilities, effortlessly lifting weights that would have challenged her just weeks ago. Scott watched in awe as Uma solved complex mathematical equations in seconds, her mind processing information at an unprecedented rate. It's like I can see the patterns more clearly now, she explained, her eyes bright with excitement and a hint of fear. As Uma's transformation progressed, Scott began to notice changes in himself as well. His reflexes sharpened, allowing him to catch falling lab equipment before it shattered on the floor. His senses heightened, picking up subtle scents and sounds that had previously gone unnoticed. During a routine physical examination, Dr. Lyra, a newly arrived Voth geneticist, noted Scott's elevated heart rate and increased muscle density. Fascinating, she murmured, her scales shifting in a pattern Scott had come to recognize as intense scientific interest. It appears the prolonged exposure to Voth pheromones is affecting your physiology as well. General Krill observed these developments with keen interest. Scott often caught the general watching him during training exercises, his expression calculating. One evening, as Scott prepared for another round of tests, alarms blared through the complex. Security personnel rushed past his room, their voices urgent and panicked. Scott pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear. Hunted protesters breached the outer perimeter. A guard's voice drifted down the corridor. Senator Vox is leading them. Scott's stomach clenched. He'd heard whispers about the growing unrest outside the academy, but he hadn't realized how serious it had become. The thought of Drell's father leading an anti-human movement sent a chill down his spine. As the complex went into lockdown, Scott found himself face-to-face with Uma. She had slipped into his room, her scales shimmering with anxiety. "Scott," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm scared. What's happening to us? To me?" The air between them crackled with tension. Scott reached out, his fingers brushing against Uma's scaled hand. The contact sent a jolt through his body, igniting a fire in his veins. Uma's eyes widened, her pupils dilating. Without a word, they moved closer, drawn together by a force neither could resist. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, years of repressed attraction exploding in a moment of shared desperation. As they pulled apart, breathless, the room's monitoring system beeped loudly. Reality crashed back in, and they sprang apart, acutely aware of the cameras capturing their every move. I should go," Uma stammered, her scales flushed with a mix of desire and embarrassment. She slipped out of the room, leaving Scott alone with his racing thoughts. The next morning, the complex was abuzz with tension. Scott caught snippets of hurried conversations as he was escorted to the main laboratory. Footage leaked. Public outrage. Emergency session of the High Council. Professor Zax met him at the lab entrance, his scales a muted gray of worry. "Scott, we have a situation," he began, his voice low. "Footage of your encounter with Uma has been leaked to the Voth public. The consequences are severe." Scott's blood ran cold. "How did this happen?" he asked, dreading the answer. Zax's expression hardened. "It was Drell. He managed to access our security feeds before we caught him. He's been expelled from the academy, but the damage is done." As they entered the lab, Scott saw Uma encased in what looked like a giant, translucent cocoon. Dr. Lyra hovered nearby, monitoring a bank of screens displaying Uma's vital signs. "Her metamorphosis has accelerated," Lyra explained, her voice tight with excitement and concern. "We're not sure what will emerge, but it's clear that your interaction yesterday triggered a significant change." Before Scott could process this information, General Krill strode into the lab, his posture rigid with scarcely controlled energy. "Roberts," Krill barked, "prepare yourself. We're addressing the Voth High Council in 3 hours. The future of our species may well depend on what happens in that chamber." As Scott struggled to formulate a response, alarms blared once again. Dr. Lyra's eyes widened as she stared at her monitors. "Uma's cocoon," she gasped. It's opening." All eyes turned to the shimmering cocoon as it began to crack, a new chapter in human-Voth relations about to unfold. Unfold. The entire lab held its breath as hairline fractures spread across the shimmering surface of Uma's cocoon. Scott's heart raced as he watched the cocoon begin to split open. Dr. Lyra rushed to her monitors, her scales flickering with a mix of excitement and apprehension. General Krill barked orders into his communication device, calling for additional security measures. With a sudden burst, the cocoon split wide open. A figure emerged, gracefully unfurling from its confines. Scott's jaw dropped as he beheld Uma's transformed state. She stood before them, a breathtaking fusion of Voth and human traits. Iridescent scales covered portions of her body, interspersed with smooth, human-like skin. Her facial features had taken on a more humanoid structure, yet retained the distinct Voth characteristics that Scott had grown to admire. Uma's eyes, now a mesmerizing blend of reptilian and human, scanned the room with heightened awareness. "Incredible," Dr. Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the blaring alarms. "Her physiological readings are off the charts." Uma took a tentative step forward, her movements fluid and precise. She flexed her arms, testing her new form. With a simple gesture, she lifted a nearby piece of heavy equipment, demonstrating strength far beyond her previous capabilities. Scott approached cautiously, his heart pounding. "Uma," he called out softly. "It's me, Scott. Do you remember?" Uma's gaze fell upon him, but her eyes showed no recognition. She tilted her head, studying him with intense curiosity. Scott felt a pang of fear. Had their connection been lost in her transformation? Before he could speak again, General Krill stepped forward. "Secure the subject," he ordered, gesturing to his security team. Professor Zax intervened, his scales darkening with concern. "General, we need time to assess her condition. This is a momentous scientific breakthrough." As the argument escalated, Dr. Lyra caught Scott's eye. She discreetly motioned towards a side door, her expression urgent. Scott understood immediately. They needed to get Uma out of there. Taking advantage of the distraction, Scott gently took Uma's hand. "Come with me," he whispered. To his relief, she didn't resist. They slipped out of the lab, Dr. Lyra close behind. As they hurried down the corridor, Uma suddenly stumbled, clutching her head. Scott steadied her, noticing her scales rippling with a cascade of colors. "What's happening?" he asked Dr. Lyra, panic edging into his voice. "Her mind is adapting to the changes," Lyra explained hurriedly. "We need to get her somewhere safe." They rounded a corner and came face to face with a squad of Voth soldiers. Before Scott could react, Uma's eyes flashed. An invisible force rippled through the air, knocking the soldiers off their feet. "This way," Dr. Lyra called out, leading them towards a maintenance hatch. "There's a network of tunnels beneath the academy. We can use them to escape." As they descended into the dimly lit tunnels, the sounds of pursuit echoed from above. Scott's mind raced, trying to process the rapid turn of events. Uma moved with inhuman grace beside him, her new form allowing her to navigate the uneven terrain with ease. They pressed on through the winding passages, the air growing thick with moisture and the musty scent of age. Suddenly, Uma froze, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond human perception. "Uma?" Scott touched her arm gently. "What is it?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of recognition. "Scott," she said, her voice a mix of familiar tones and new resonances. "I remember." Relief washed over Scott, but before he could respond, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Uma's eyes widened in alarm. "I didn't mean to," she gasped as the vibrations intensified. Dr. Lyra's scales paled. "Her abilities are unstable. We need to keep moving before the tunnels collapse." They pressed on, dodging falling debris as Uma's unintentional seismic disturbance shook the underground network. Scott's enhanced reflexes came into play as he pulled Dr. Lyra out of the path of a falling rock. As they navigated the chaos, Uma's memories seemed to resurface in waves. She gripped Scott's hand tightly, her eyes filled with a mix of wonder and fear. "What's happening to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We'll figure it out together," Scott reassured her, even as uncertainty gnawed at him. They emerged from the tunnels on the outskirts of the academy grounds, only to be confronted by a scene of widespread panic. In the distance, they could see protesters clashing with security forces. Military vehicles rolled through the streets, and news broadcasts on public screens declared a state of emergency. "The situation has escalated beyond our control," Dr. Lyra said, her voice tight with worry. "Senator Vox is using this to push his anti-human agenda." As they caught their breath, hidden in the shadow of a massive Voth structure, Scott's communication device buzzed. He activated it to find an urgent message from the human ambassador. "Scott," the ambassador's voice crackled through the device. "The situation is critical. Senator Vox has ordered a planet-wide lockdown and the arrest of all humans on Voth territories. You need to act fast to prevent an interstellar incident. You have my authorization to take any necessary action to secure Uma and stabilize the situation. The eyes of the galaxy are upon us." As the gravity of their situation sank in, movement in the shadows caught Scott's attention. A familiar figure emerged, scales dark with a mix of emotions. "Drell," Scott breathed, tensing for a confrontation. The expelled Voth student stood before them, his eyes fixed on Uma's transformed form. For a moment, no one moved. Then Uma stepped forward, her new features softening with empathy. "Drell," she said, her voice carrying new depths of understanding. "We need your help." As Drell's expression shifted from hostility to awe, Scott realized that their next moves would shape not just their own fates, but the future of human-Voth relations and perhaps the balance of power in the galaxy itself. With General Krill's forces closing in and chaos engulfing the planet, they had to formulate a plan, and fast. Fast. With General Krill's forces closing in and chaos engulfing the planet, they had to formulate a plan, and quickly. Drell's eyes darted between Scott and Uma, his scales shifting from hostility to a mix of awe and uncertainty. I never meant for this to happen, he stammered, his gaze lingering on Uma's transformed form. Uma stepped forward, her new physiology allowing her to move with fluid grace. She placed a hand on Drell's shoulder, her touch gentle despite her enhanced strength. We know, Drell, but right now, we need your help to prevent this situation from escalating further. Scott's mind raced, piecing together a plan. The Voth High Council and the public need to hear the truth directly from us, he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Drell, you know the Academy's systems better than anyone. Is there a way we can access the planet-wide emergency broadcast system? Drell's eyes widened, his scales flickering with a mix of excitement and fear. There's a hidden communications hub within the campus, he replied, his voice lowering conspiratorially. It's designed for use during planetary emergencies. If we can reach it, we might be able to override the system and broadcast to the entire Voth population. Dr. Lyra nodded approvingly. It's risky, but it might be our best chance to stabilize the situation. With their plan set, the group cautiously emerged from their hiding spot. The streets were in chaos, filled with protesters clashing with security forces. Military vehicles rumbled in the distance, adding to the cacophony of alarms and shouting. Uma took point, her enhanced senses alert for any danger. As they navigated through the turmoil, her new abilities proved both a blessing and a curse. When a group of rioters charged towards them, Uma instinctively raised her hand. An invisible force rippled through the air, pushing the attackers back without harming them. Incredible, Drell murmured, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his apprehension. However, as they rounded a corner, Uma's control slipped. A sudden burst of electromagnetic energy pulsed from her body, shorting out nearby electronics. Streetlights flickered and died, and a nearby hovercraft sputtered to a halt. Uma, focus, Scott said softly, taking her hand. Try to control the energy. Channel it. Don't let it control you. Uma nodded, her eyes meeting Scott's. She took a deep breath, and Scott could feel the energy coursing through her begin to stabilize. They pressed on, Uma gradually gaining more control over her newfound powers. As they neared the Academy grounds, Drell suddenly pulled them into a shadowy alcove. Krill's forces, he hissed, pointing to a convoy of military vehicles approaching. Scott's enhanced vision picked out details the others missed. Mounted on several of the vehicles was an unfamiliar device, its design suggesting some sort of energy weapon. They've got new tech, he warned. We need to be careful. They weaved through back alleys and service corridors, Drell's intimate knowledge of the campus layout proving invaluable. As they approached the communications hub, the sound of pursuing forces grew louder. Suddenly, they found themselves cornered in a large courtyard. General Krill emerged from a transport, flanked by heavily armed soldiers. His scales were dark with perseverance as he fixed his gaze on Uma. Stand down, Krill commanded, his voice carrying across the open space. Uma, you must see reason. Your abilities could be the key to advancing our species. Surrender now, and I promise we will use your gifts for the betterment of all Voth. Uma stepped forward, her transformed features set in a resolute expression. I am not a weapon, General, she replied, her voice steady. My transformation is not something to be exploited, but understood. We need cooperation, not conflict. Krill's expression hardened. So be it, he growled, signaling his troops. Activate the pulse generator. The devices Scott had noticed earlier hummed to life, emitting a high-pitched whine. Uma stumbled, crying out in pain as the electromagnetic pulse washed over her. Scott rushed to her side, his own body reacting to the energy field. As their hands touched, something extraordinary happened. The unique combination of their pheromones and Uma's new physiology created a localized field around them. The pain subsided, replaced by a surge of energy that coursed through both their bodies. Uma's eyes met Scott's. a look of understanding passing between them. She turned to face Krill's forces, raising her hands. A controlled electromagnetic burst emanated from her, far more powerful than before. The pulse generators sparked and died, and the soldiers' weapons fell useless to the ground. Nearby news drones captured the entire scene, broadcasting it live across the planet. The image of Uma standing tall with Scott by her side, their combined power neutralizing Krill's forces without bloodshed, was seen by millions of Voth citizens. Taking advantage of the momentary confusion, the group sprinted the final distance to the communications hub. Drell's fingers flew over the control panel, bypassing security protocols with ease. "We're in," he announced, a note of triumph in his voice. "The system is ours." Uma stepped up to the broadcast terminal, Scott close beside her. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. As the signal went live, she began to speak, her words reaching every corner of the Voth world. "People of Voth," she began, her voice strong and clear. "I am Uma, and what you have witnessed today is not an aberration, but a new possibility for our future." As Uma continued her address, explaining her transformation and the potential for human-Voth compatibility, an extraordinary phenomenon began to unfold across the planet. Reports flooded in of other Voth females, those who had been in prolonged contact with humans, exhibiting signs of transformation. The Voth High Council, watching the broadcast in stunned silence, saw their world changing before their eyes. As Uma's words resonated across the planet, the council members exchanged glances, knowing that the course of their civilization had been irrevocably altered. In the communications hub, Scott, Uma, and their allies watched as the impact of their actions rippled across Voth society. They had taken a stand, but the true challenge, navigating the new reality they had unleashed, was just beginning. Beginning was just beginning. The impact of Uma's broadcast reverberated across Voth society, triggering a cascade of unprecedented events. Reports flooded in from across the planet of other Voth females exhibiting signs of transformation, particularly those who had prolonged contact with humans. The Voth High Council, faced with this paradigm-shifting reality, found themselves at a crossroads. Within days, under mounting public pressure, the council agreed to a historic joint session with human diplomatic representatives. Scott and Uma received an official summons to attend as key witnesses and living proof of human Voth compatibility. As they prepared for the momentous meeting, Scott and Uma noticed a startling development in their own physiology. Their bond had intensified, creating a symbiotic boost to their abilities when in close proximity. Scott found his cognitive functions sharpening dramatically, his mind racing with newfound clarity and insight. Uma, meanwhile, discovered an unprecedented level of control over her powers, able to manipulate electromagnetic fields with pinpoint precision. "It's like I can feel the electrons dancing around us," Uma said, her eyes wide with wonder as she generated a small pulsing orb of energy between her palms. Scott nodded, his enhanced perception allowing him to see the subtle flickers of energy. "And I can almost see the patterns in the field. It's incredible." Their preparation was interrupted by an urgent call from Dr. Lyra. Her voice crackled with excitement over the comm system. "Scott, Uma, I've made a breakthrough. My research has uncovered evidence of an ancient Voth installation on a nearby moon. It might hold the answers we're looking for about the origins of human Voth compatibility." The news spread quickly, and the High Council, recognizing the potential significance of this discovery, authorized an immediate expedition to the moon. Given their unique abilities, Scott and Uma were assigned to the team, their attendance at the joint session temporarily postponed. As the expedition prepared for launch, tension gripped the spaceport. Anti-human extremists, led by the firebrand Senator Vox, had caught wind of the mission. Determined to maintain Voth isolation, they staged a daring attack on the launch site. Alarms blared as Scott and Uma raced to protect the expedition team. They found themselves on the front lines, their enhanced abilities put to the test. Scott's heightened reflexes allowed him to anticipate and counter the attackers' moves, while Uma used her electromagnetic powers to disable their weapons. In the heat of the conflict, Uma's abilities manifested in an unexpected way. As a group of extremists charged towards them, she instinctively raised her hands. A large-scale electromagnetic field rippled outward, not only neutralizing the attackers' weapons but also seeming to calm their aggression. The charging Voth slowed, their scales shifting from dark, angry patterns to softer, more neutral tones. "Uma," Scott called out, his enhanced mind quickly processing the implications. "Can you expand the field?" Nodding, Uma closed her eyes in concentration. The electromagnetic aura grew, encompassing more of the conflict zone. Scott watched in amazement as the fighting began to subside, Voth on both sides lowering their weapons and backing away from confrontation. As the situation stabilized, news drones captured the scene, broadcasting Uma's nonviolent intervention across the planet. The tide of public opinion began to shift, with many Voth now seeing the potential benefits of human-Voth integration. With the immediate threat neutralized, the expedition team scrambled to complete launch preparations. As Scott and Uma helped secure the ship, a familiar figure approached. General Krill, his scales a mix of commitment and uncertainty, stepped forward. "I have a proposition for you," Krill said, his voice low. "I've been working against Senator Vox's extremist faction in secret. I can offer my military expertise to protect this mission." Scott eyed the general warily, memories of their past confrontations fresh in his mind. "Why the sudden change of heart, General?" Krill's scales rippled with a complex array of emotions. "I've seen enough to know that isolation is no longer an option for our people. This mission may be our best chance to understand our true history and secure our future." Recognizing the strategic value of Krill's support, Scott cautiously accepted the offer. With the general's assistance, the final preparations were completed in record time. The expedition launched amidst a media frenzy, the eyes of both the Voth population and human diplomatic corps fixed on the departing ship. As they approached the mysterious moon, long-dormant Voth defense systems suddenly sprang to life. Energy beams lanced out from hidden emplacements, forcing the ship into evasive maneuvers. The Voth pilot struggled to navigate the hazardous environment, his hands trembling on the controls. Scott and Uma exchanged a glance, a spark of understanding passing between them. Moving in unison, they approached the ship's sensor array. Scott placed his hand on the control panel, his enhanced cognitive abilities interfacing with the ship's systems. Uma stood beside him, channeling her electromagnetic powers to boost the sensor's capabilities. Together, they created a real-time, three-dimensional map of the defenses, guiding the pilot through the treacherous field. "Bank left," Scott called out, his voice steady. "Now dive 30 degrees. The ship responded, weaving through the barrage with increasing confidence. As they neared the surface, Uma's powers reached out, creating a protective electromagnetic bubble around the vessel. The remaining energy beams dissipated harmlessly against the field. With a final, skillful maneuver, the ship touched down on the moon's surface. As the dust settled, the expedition team gazed out at a desolate landscape dotted with ancient, weathered structures. At the center of it all stood a massive doorway, its surface covered in intricate Voth inscriptions. Dr. Lyra approached the entrance, her eyes wide with academic excitement. "This is it," she breathed, running her hand over the symbols. "The answers we've been seeking may lie just beyond this door." As the team prepared to enter the complex, Scott and Uma stood at the threshold of discovery. The mysteries of their shared past and the potential future of human-Voth relations waited within. With a shared nod of drive, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever secrets the ancient installation might hold. Reveal. The team cautiously entered the ancient structure, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As they ventured deeper into the complex, Scott and Uma found themselves drawn to a massive sealed chamber. "Look at these markings," Uma said, tracing her fingers along the intricate patterns etched into the door. "They seem to pulse with energy." Scott nodded, feeling a strange resonance within his body. "It's like they're reacting to our presence." As they approached the sealed entrance, their bodies began to tingle with an otherworldly sensation. Suddenly, the patterns on the door flared to life, pulsing with brilliant blue light. A low hum filled the air as the massive doors slowly began to part. "Incredible," Dr. Lyra breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. It appears your unique physiology has activated some kind of locking mechanism. The team stepped into a vast chamber filled with technology beyond their wildest imaginations. Sleek, opalescent surfaces gleamed under soft, ambient lighting, and holographic displays flickered to life around them. At the center of the room stood a towering structure that drew their attention. As they approached, a shimmering figure materialized before them. It was neither fully human nor Voth, but a perfect blend of both species. Its voice, when it spoke, resonated with ancient wisdom. Greetings, children of two worlds. I am the Guardian, an artificial intelligence created by the precursors. Scott and Uma exchanged glances, their enhanced minds racing to process this revelation. Dr. Lyra stepped forward, her voice trembling with excitement. Precursors? Who were they? And why did they create this facility? The Guardian's form shimmered as it began to explain. The precursors were an ancient species who foresaw a great threat to the galaxy. They engineered both humans and Voth as part of a grand experiment in species compatibility and evolution. Images flashed around them, showing the long history of both races and their parallel development. The Guardian continued, You were created with complementary traits and a built-in compatibility, designed to eventually reunite and unlock your full potential. Uma gasped, her scales shifting colors rapidly. The transformations occurring among our people. Yes, the Guardian confirmed. They are the result of a long-dormant genetic program activated by prolonged human contact. As the Guardian spoke, the complex's systems whirred to life. Beams of light swept over Scott and Uma, scanning their bodies. Dr. Lyra rushed to a nearby console, her fingers flying over the controls as she analyzed the incoming data. This is extraordinary, she exclaimed. Scott, Uma, your physiological connection is far more advanced than any other human-Voth pairing we've observed. The data suggests... Her words were cut short by a deafening alarm that suddenly blared throughout the complex. The Guardian's form flickered, its voice urgent. Warning, the facility's power core has become unstable. Millennia of dormancy followed by sudden activation has created a critical imbalance. If not stabilized immediately, this moon and all on it will be destroyed. Panic swept through the expedition team. General Krill immediately began coordinating evacuation procedures, barking orders into his communicator. Dr. Lyra looked torn between the wealth of knowledge at her fingertips and the imminent danger. The Guardian turned to Scott and Uma. You two are the key. Your combined abilities can stabilize the core, but the process is dangerous and untested. You must decide quickly. Scott met Uma's gaze, seeing his own purpose mirrored in her eyes. Without a word, they both nodded. We'll do it, Scott said firmly. The rest of you need to evacuate, Uma added, addressing the team. We can't risk everyone's lives. As the expedition team rushed to escape, Scott and Uma followed the Guardian's instructions, navigating through a series of hazardous chambers. Their enhanced abilities allowed them to overcome obstacles that would have been insurmountable to others. They leapt across chasms of crackling energy, their movements perfectly synchronized. Uma used her electromagnetic powers to deflect arcs of unstable energy, while Scott's heightened reflexes allowed him to guide them through a maze of shifting corridors. With each challenge, their physiological bond intensified. Scott found he could anticipate Uma's movements before she made them, while Uma felt Scott's thoughts as clearly as her own. Finally, they reached the heart of the complex. The power core pulsed before them, a swirling vortex of energy threatening to tear itself apart. Now, the Guardian's voice echoed in their minds. You must channel the excess energy through your bodies. Trust in your bond. Scott and Uma positioned themselves on opposite sides of the core. They reached out, their hands enveloped by tendrils of pure energy. Pain seared through their bodies as they struggled to contain the massive power output. Uma gritted her teeth, her scales flashing rapidly with the strain. Scott, she gasped, I don't know if we can... We can, Scott replied, his voice strained but determined. Together. As they pushed their enhanced physiologies to the limit, something unexpected happened. Their combined energy signature began to resonate with the ancient precursor technology. The core's chaotic energy started to stabilize, flowing through Scott and Uma in a harmonious circuit. Suddenly, the entire complex hummed with renewed life. The Guardian's voice rang out, filled with a note of triumph. Remarkable! You've not only stabilized the core, but activated a hidden network of similar facilities across the galaxy. The next phase of the Precursor's plan has begun. As the immediate danger passed, Scott and Uma collapsed to the floor, their bodies trembling from the ordeal. But something had changed. Their minds felt more entwined than ever before, thoughts and sensations flowing freely between them. Scott, Uma whispered, her eyes wide with wonder and a hint of fear. I can feel everything you're feeling. It's like we're one being. Scott nodded, equally awestruck by this new level of connection. I know, it's incredible, but also terrifying, Uma finished his thought. As they helped each other to their feet, the full implications of their evolving relationship began to sink in. They had unlocked a new stage in human Voth compatibility, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both their species. The Guardian's form appeared before them once more. You have done well, but this is only the beginning. The activation of the Precursor network has set in motion events that will prepare humanity, the Voth, and other compatible species for the coming galactic threat. Scott and Uma exchanged a look, sensing the weight of responsibility settling upon them. As they made their way back through the now stabilized complex, they knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The knowledge they had gained would forever change the course of human-Voth relations, and potentially the hope of the universe itself. Emerging from the ancient structure, they found the expedition team waiting anxiously. Dr. Lyra rushed forward, her face a mix of relief and burning curiosity. General Krill stood at attention, his scales shifting with impossibly strong questions. As Scott and Uma prepared to share their extraordinary discoveries, they knew that the political landscape they would return to on Zorthar would be more complex than ever. The anti-human faction led by Senator Vox would not give up easily, and implementing the Precursor's plan would face numerous obstacles. But for now, as they boarded the ship to return home, Scott and Uma took comfort in their newfound connection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their bond a living testament to the potential of human-Voth unity. Compatibility would shape their shared destiny. As their ship docked at the Voth capital spaceport, Scott and Uma were met with a flurry of activity. News of their discovery had spread rapidly, and a crowd of curious onlookers gathered to catch a glimpse of the human-Voth pair. Dr. Lyra hurried off the ship, her arms full of data crystals, while General Krill barked orders to his security detail. We need to get you two to the High Council immediately, Krill said, his scales shifting to a serious blue-gray. The implications of what we found are astronomical. Scott and Uma nodded in unison, their synchronized movements drawing gasps from the crowd. As they made their way through the throng, whispers and pointed fingers followed in their wake. Look at how they move together, one Voth murmured. Is it true? Are they becoming one being? Another asked. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of debriefings, medical examinations, and heated debates among the Voth High Council. Earth's diplomatic corps arrived in force, setting up a temporary embassy to handle the influx of information and requests for cooperation. As the dust began to settle, a grand summit was announced. Representatives from various alien species across the galaxy were invited to Zorthar to learn about the Precursor's plan and the role of human-Voth compatibility in facing the impending galactic threat. The day of the summit arrived, and Scott and Uma found themselves standing before a diverse crowd of alien dignitaries in the Voth capital's grand amphitheater. The air buzzed with anticipation and a hint of apprehension. High Counselor Zhen, the leader of the Voth government, stepped forward to address the gathering. Esteemed delegates, we stand at a crossroads of galactic history. The discoveries made by our expedition team have revealed a truth that will shape the future of all our species. As Zhen spoke, Scott felt Uma's presence in his mind, a comforting warmth that steadied his nerves. He could sense her anxiety mingling with his own, creating a shared pool of emotion that they both drew strength from. Dr. Lyra took the stage next, presenting her findings with nearly unleashed excitement. The activation of dormant genes is spreading among the Voth population, she explained, gesturing to a holographic display of DNA strands. While the process is slower than what we've observed in Scott and Uma, it's undeniable proof of the precursor's genetic engineering. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the implications sank in. Scott squeezed Uma's hand, feeling the scales on her palm shift slightly in response. And now, High Counselor Jen announced, we asked Scott and Uma to demonstrate their enhanced abilities and unique bond. Taking a deep breath, Scott and Uma stepped forward. They moved in perfect synchronization, their bodies flowing like water as they performed a series of complex maneuvers. As their movements grew more intricate, gasps of awe echoed through the amphitheater. Suddenly, a group of holographic obstacles appeared around them, courtesy of Dr. Lyra's team. Without missing a beat, Scott and Uma navigated the shifting maze, anticipating each other's thoughts and actions with uncanny precision. As the demonstration reached its climax, Scott and Uma stood back to back, their minds fully merged. They spoke in unison, their voices blending into a harmonious whole that sent shivers through the audience. This is the potential of human Voth compatibility, they said, a unity of thought and action that transcends the limitations of our individual species. The amphitheater erupted in applause and excited chatter. Even the most skeptical delegates couldn't deny the power of what they'd witnessed. As the initial excitement subsided, a group of scientists took the stage to present their proposal. We believe we can accelerate the activation of compatible genes in both humans and Voth using technology recovered from the moon base, the lead scientist explained. The proposal ignited a fierce debate among the delegates. Some argued it was a necessary step to prepare for the coming threat, while others feared the loss of their species' unique identities. Scott and Uma listened intently, their minds processing the arguments from both sides simultaneously. They could see the merit in both viewpoints, but before they could voice their thoughts, chaos erupted. A group of armed Voth burst into the amphitheater, led by a familiar face, Senator Vox. They wielded strange, pulsing weapons that Scott recognized from the precursor facility. "This madness ends now," Vox shouted, his scales flashing a violent red. "We will not allow our species to be corrupted by human influence." As panic spread through the crowd, Scott and Uma locked eyes. Without a word, they sprang into action, their movements fluid and purposeful. They weaved through the panicked delegates, using their enhanced abilities to deflect energy blasts and protect the civilians. Other partially transformed Voth in the audience, inspired by Scott and Uma's display, joined the fight. A ragtag defense force formed around them, pushing back against Vox's extremists. In the midst of the battle, Scott and Uma found themselves face-to-face with a cluster of Vox's followers wielding precursor weapons. As energy blasts sizzled past them, Scott had a sudden realization. "Uma," he called out mentally, "remember how we interfaced with the moonbase's systems?" Uma's eyes widened in understanding. Together they reached out with their minds, seeking the familiar hum of precursor technology. The weapons in the attacker's hands began to vibrate, then suddenly went dark. Vox, seeing his advantage slip away, turned to flee, but his path was blocked by a familiar figure, his son, Drell. "Father, stop this madness," Drell pleaded, his scales shifting between conflict and commitment. "Can't you see the potential for our people?" As Vox was led away in restraints, the amphitheater fell into an uneasy quiet. The attack, while terrifying, had become a powerful demonstration of human Voth potential. Delegates who had been skeptical now looked at Scott and Uma with newfound respect and curiosity. In the aftermath of the attack, as medical teams tended to the injured and security forces secured the area, General Krill approached Scott and Uma with a grim expression. "We've just received a message from the moon base," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The long-range sensors have detected an anomaly at the edge of our solar system. It's faint, but it's moving towards Zorthar." Scott and Uma exchanged a look of understanding. The threat the precursors had warned about was no longer a distant possibility. It was a looming reality. As the summit delegates regrouped, shaken but determined, The Voth High Council and Earth's representatives made a unanimous decision. A joint task force would be established, with Scott and Uma at its core, to develop strategies for enhancing human-Voth integration and preparing defenses against the approaching threat. The newly formed task force wasted no time. Plans were quickly drawn up for Scott and Uma to embark on a mission to other worlds, seeking out compatible species and ancient precursor sites to unlock more of the galactic defense network. As they prepared for their departure from Zorthar, Scott and Uma stood on a balcony overlooking the Voth capital. The city buzzed with a new energy, a mix of excitement and apprehension about the changes to come. Uma turned to Scott, her scales shimmering with a complex mix of emotions. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her thoughts intertwining with his. Scott nodded, feeling the weight of their responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Together," he replied, both aloud and in their shared mind space, "we can face anything." As the twin suns of Zorthar dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a golden glow, Scott and Uma looked to the stars. Somewhere out there, the next chapter of their journey awaited, a journey that would test the limits of their abilities, their bond, and the very future of galactic civilization. Civilization. As they turned away from the view, a message flashed on Scott's communicator. It was from Dr. Lyra, requesting their immediate presence at the research facility. Upon arrival, they found the facility bustling with activity. Scientists and engineers moved purposefully between workstations, their excitement palpable. Dr. Lyra greeted them with a gleam in her eye. "We've made significant breakthroughs," she said, leading them to a secure room. Inside, 2 sleek bodysuits hung on display. "These are designed to amplify and control your abilities." Scott ran his hand over the material, feeling a subtle vibration. Uma's scales shifted in curiosity as she examined her suit. "The neural interface is the key," Dr. Lyra explained, pointing to a delicate web of circuitry woven into the fabric. "It will enhance your mental connection, allowing for more efficient thought and sensation sharing." As Scott and Uma donned the suits, they felt an immediate difference. Their shared consciousness expanded, thoughts flowing between them with unprecedented clarity. "This is incredible," Scott breathed, feeling Uma's agreement resonate through their bond. Over the next weeks, they underwent intensive training, pushing the limits of their enhanced abilities. They learned to manipulate energy fields, move objects with their minds, and even perceive potential futures. The partially transformed Voth who had volunteered for their crew joined in, eager to explore their own evolving capabilities. Among the volunteers was Drell, his scales now a shimmering blend of Voth patterns and human-like textures. He approached Scott and Uma during a break in training, his eyes filled with willpower. "I want to make amends," Drell said, his voice steady. "My father's actions. I need to prove that not all of us think that way." Scott nodded, sensing Uma's approval through their link. "We're glad to have you on board, Drell." As their departure date neared, the team made one final visit to the moon base. The ancient Voth complex seemed to hum with anticipation as Scott and Uma approached the central chamber. Placing their hands on the control panel, they felt the familiar surge of energy. Suddenly, a new section of the wall slid open, revealing a previously hidden chamber. Inside, a holographic map of the galaxy sprang to life, dotted with pulsing lights indicating precursor sites. "This is it," Uma whispered, her scales shifting in awe. "Our roadmap." Back on Zorthar, the team boarded their new ship, the Harmony. Its sleek design incorporated both human and Voth aesthetics, a physical representation of their newfound unity. The experimental faster-than-light drive hummed with potential, promising to carry them across vast interstellar distances. As the Harmony broke free of Zorthar's atmosphere, Scott and Uma stood on the bridge, their hands intertwined. Through their neural link, they shared a mix of excitement and apprehension. Their first destination appeared on the navigation screen, Krell X, a distant world where another precursor complex awaited. As the ship accelerated to FTL speeds, the stars blurred into streaks of light. Days into their journey, alarms blared throughout the ship. Scott and Uma rushed to the bridge, where Drell was manning the sensors. "We're approaching Krell X," Drell reported, his scales flickering with concern. "But there's a problem." On the display, a massive energy field surrounded the entire planet, shimmering like a soap bubble. "It's impenetrable," the ship's pilot announced. "We can't land." Scott and Uma exchanged a glance, an unspoken plan forming in their shared consciousness. They moved to the front of the bridge, placing their hands on the ship's interface panels. "We're going to try something," Scott said to the crew. "Brace yourselves." Channeling their combined energy through the ship's systems, Scott and Uma projected a focused beam towards the planet. The energy field rippled and distorted, slowly opening a narrow passage. Sweat beaded on Scott's forehead, and Uma's scales paled with effort. The ship inched forward through the opening, the hull groaning under the strain. As they breached the atmosphere, Scott and Uma collapsed, their energy depleted. Drell rushed to their side as the ship's emergency systems took over, guiding them to a landing. Recovering in the medical bay, Scott and Uma shared a weary smile. "We did it," Uma said softly. "But at what cost?" Scott replied, feeling the lingering exhaustion in their bond. "We'll need to be more careful." As they prepared to disembark, the ship's sensors detected signs of civilization. The team stepped onto the surface of Krail X, unsure of what they would find. They didn't have to wait long. A group of tall, willowy beings emerged from the nearby forest, their skins shimmering with an inner light. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand in what seemed to be a gesture of peace. "Welcome, travelers," the being said, its voice resonating in their minds rather than their ears. "We are the Zen. We have long awaited your arrival." Scott and Uma shared a surprised look. How could the Zen have been expecting them? As they stepped forward to greet their hosts, they realized their journey had only just begun, and Kralex held secrets that would change everything they thought they knew about their mission. Mission and the secrets they held. As they approached the Zen, Scott and Uma felt a subtle shift in their shared consciousness, their bond expanding to encompass this new, enigmatic species. The Zen guided them through the lush forests of Krell-X, their ethereal forms gliding effortlessly over the terrain. The team marveled at the planet's bioluminescent flora and crystalline structures that seemed to pulse with an inner energy. "Your arrival marks the beginning of a great journey," the lead Zen communicated telepathically. "We are but one of many species you will encounter on your path." Over the next months, the crew of the Harmony embarked on a whirlwind tour of the galaxy. Each world they visited presented unique challenges and opportunities. On the aquatic planet Norex, they helped negotiate a peace treaty between warring factions of sentient coral reefs. The desert world of Ixtan saw them uncover a buried precursor facility, revealing crucial information about the network of ancient sites spread across the stars. As they traveled, Scott and Uma's abilities continued to evolve. Their mental link deepened, allowing them to perceive the subtle connections between all living things. This heightened awareness proved invaluable as they navigated the complex web of interspecies diplomacy. Drell, too, found his place among the crew. His unique perspective as a partially transformed Voth helped bridge cultural gaps with the diverse beings they encountered. On more than one occasion, his quick thinking and diplomatic skills prevented potentially disastrous misunderstandings. The Harmony's journey took them to the far reaches of the galaxy, each stop bringing them closer to understanding the precursor's grand design. They gathered allies, awakened dormant technologies, and slowly pieced together the puzzle of galactic evolution. As they approached their final destination, a sense of anticipation rippled through the crew. The mysterious planet at the heart of the precursor network loomed before them, shrouded in swirling clouds of energy. "Sensors are going haywire," Drell reported from his station. "The evolutionary phenomenon is intensifying exponentially." Scott and Uma exchanged a glance, their shared consciousness already formulating a plan. They moved to the center of the bridge, placing their hands on the ship's interface panels. "Everyone, brace yourself," Scott called out. "We're going to create a protective field around the ship." As the Harmony plunged into the maelstrom of energy surrounding the planet, Scott and Uma channeled their combined power through the ship's systems. A shimmering bubble of force enveloped the vessel, deflecting the chaotic waves of evolutionary energy. The ship shuddered and groaned under the strain, but the protective field held. With a final burst of power from Scott and Uma, The harmony broke through the turbulent atmosphere, emerging into a serene sky above a landscape of impossible beauty. As they touched down on the planet's surface, the crew gazed in awe at their surroundings. Crystalline spires reached toward the sky, their facets reflecting light in mesmerizing patterns. The very air seemed alive with potential, each breath filling them with a sense of limitless possibility. At the center of it all stood a structure that dwarfed even the grandest precursor sites they had encountered before. Its design defied easy description, seeming to shift and change as they approached. Scott and Uma led the way, their steps sure and purposeful. As they neared the entrance, a massive crystal structure at the heart of the facility pulsed with blinding energy. The couple paused, feeling the weight of destiny upon them. "This is it," Uma said, her scales shimmering with anticipation. "Everything we've been through has led us to this moment." Scott nodded, squeezing her hand. "Together," he said simply. As they stepped forward, their combined essence resonated with the crystal. The air around them shimmered, and a holographic image sprang to life. The figure before them was unlike any being they had encountered, a synthesis of countless evolutionary paths, radiating wisdom and power. "Greetings, children of the stars," the precursor's voice echoed in their minds. "You have proven yourselves worthy of the great responsibility we have prepared for you." The hologram's message unfolded, revealing the true purpose behind the precursor's grand experiment. They spoke of the delicate balance of evolution, the need for guardians to shepherd the development of life across the galaxy. As the message concluded, Scott and Uma found themselves faced with a monumental choice. The crystal structure before them hummed with potential, offering the power to become the custodians the precursors had envisioned. They turned to their crew, seeing the mix of awe and uncertainty on their faces. Drell stepped forward, his scales shifting in a complex pattern of emotion. "Whatever you decide," he said, voice thick with feeling, "know that we stand with you." Scott and Uma shared a final, silent moment of communication. In that instant, they relived their entire journey, from their first meeting at the Voth Academy to this pivotal moment. With a shared nod of dedication, they turned back to the crystal. Hand in hand, they stepped into the pulsing energy field. Light enveloped them, their physical forms becoming indistinct as they merged with the ancient technology. The crew shielded their eyes as the brilliance intensified, the very fabric of reality seeming to bend and warp around Scott and Uma. In a flash of transcendent energy, Scott and Uma ascended to a new plane of existence. Their consciousness expanded beyond the confines of their physical forms, reaching out across the vastness of the galaxy. They perceived the intricate web of life connecting all beings, the delicate balance of evolution teetering on the brink of chaos. With their newfound powers, they reached out, touching the genetic structures of countless species.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.